Welcome to Philosophy 220, Ethics. This video will cover the material by Plato, Euthyphro, and Republic. Plato and Socrates are both historical persons. That is, they were real people who lived in Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era. In fact, Plato was the pupil of Socrates. We don't have any writing by Socrates, but in his writing, Plato used Socrates as a character in dialogues where philosophical concepts are explored. Usually, Socrates talks to another person in the dialogue, trying to come up with a definition of some particular philosophical idea, such as justice, beauty. As you'll see with the dialogue Euthyphro, they'll be talking about the definition of piety. As you know, the setting of the dialogue Euthyphro has Euthyphro, the character, meeting Socrates at the court of the King Archon. Socrates is there because he's being tried by the Athenian Senate for corrupting the youth, making weaker arguments appear stronger, and for worshiping false gods. Euthyphro, on the other hand, is at the court because he's prosecuting his father for murder. What he's doing is irregular because Euthyphro's father, while he may have been responsible to some degree, the event itself seems, at least to Socrates, not to rise to the level of murder. So he asks Euthyphro why he is doing what he's doing, why he is prosecuting his own father on a very strong charge based on the actual situation. Euthyphro's answer is that piety requires that he prosecute his father. Now, what does he mean by piety? In the setting, the court and the religion of the Greeks are intertwined. So as you can see from the prior slide, Euthyphro's father didn't know what to do with the person that killed the servant of the Euthyphro family. So because he bound him and put him in the ditch, he wound up dying of exposure and hunger. Euthyphro's father wasn't sure what to do. And that's why Euthyphro's father is responsible for the death of the laborer. However, as Euthyphro and Socrates talk about the concept of piety in Euthyphro, you'll see it veers away from Euthyphro's particular case, and Socrates is aiming for a more general definition. Euthyphro then comes up with definitions of piety. You can see here some of the definitions that Euthyphro comes up with and the reason that Socrates tells him that the definition doesn't work. Now, let me stop here and say that Socratic dialogues are famous for this process. Socrates will ask someone for a definition, the other person gives him the definition, and then Socrates says, well, that doesn't work because of X, Y, Z. Just as in Euthyphro, every definition that Euthyphro develops, Socrates has a reason to say that there's a problem. Ultimately, Euthyphro will offer a definition of piety that it is what the gods love, what's loved by all the gods, as well. Socrates points out that problem. However, the dialogue ends without Euthyphro and Socrates coming to a conclusion. This is very common in Socratic dialogues. We call it aporia. You might wonder why Plato would have a dialogue end with no answer. And the reason for it is that Plato is trying to show that the most important philosophical concepts are very difficult to capture in words. He's trying to show what piety is rather than tell you what it is. And he shows you through the process of the speakers in the dialogue. You might want to note also that with the exception of apology, all of the scenarios in Plato's dialogues are fictitious. The purpose of them is not to tell you what had happened at some point, but to have the reader think through the philosophical problem with the characters. What philosophical problem is he looking at in Euthyphro? Well, there's a question about what we call a divine command theory of ethics. A divine command theory is one that says what's morally right or morally wrong is determined by a particular religious tradition. So you can imagine that there's ethics that would stem from any religious tradition. So for example, in the Greek case, Euthyphro offers the idea that what all the gods love is what's morally right, what they all hate is morally wrong. Socrates considers this view as Euthyphro offers it. And he points out a problem. The problem with the divine command theory is that whatever is morally good or bad, whatever would be considered pious or impious, is either good or bad in and of itself, and that's why the gods love it, or the moral value of the action is determined by the gods' love or by their hate, whichever the case may be. If the second option is true, if morally good acts are morally good simply because they're willed by the gods, then it seems as though the gods can will any kind of action to be morally good or morally bad, regardless of its inherent value. In other words, the gods could decide arbitrarily that they want the killing of pets to be morally praiseworthy. The conflict is that we hear that and we know to ourselves that can't be right, because there is an inherent moral value in the action. So if the gods love an action because it's good on its own, then moral value comes from some source other than the gods. Incidentally, the gods could then also put moral praise or blame on morally neutral activities too. Say, for example, the act of looking at hedgehogs by the light of the moon seems morally neutral. However, if the second prong is right, this is what Socrates is saying, then the gods can decide that anything at all is good or bad. In either case, there's a deep problem with the divine command theory. Now we'll move on to the material in Plato's Republic. As you can see from looking at your reader, this is a long and complicated work. In your reader, you have just but a fraction of the material in the whole work of Republic. The sections that we're going to be looking at are where the interlocutors try to come up with a definition of justice. That fails and ends up in aporia. Socrates is then challenged to make a strong argument that justice is valuable for its own sake. And in doing so, Socrates lines out what justice in an individual soul looks like by way of a thought experiment. In Book 1, you'll see Socrates survey different definitions of justice. And the last one that he considers, offered to him by the sophist Thrasymachus, is that with which Plato is the most concerned. First, you'll see justice as paying one's debts. So for example, if I loan you my car, it would be justice for you to return it to me. You'll want to read carefully and see where the problems are there for Socrates. Then there's the idea that justice is helping your friends and harming your enemies. Sometimes this is called the Homeric code of ethics. Socrates points out some problems here as well. We have Thrasymachus' definition that justice is whatever the ruling power structure determines it to be. Socrates objects with this idea by arguing that ruling is, like any other kind of vocation, a craft. So the craftsman can't be doing the craft solely for his own good, but for the sake of the craft itself. While we leave Book 1, we leave Socrates in a difficult position, because Thrasymachus has just offered a definition of justice, which Plato finds deeply, deeply uncomfortable. The definition that Thrasymachus offers is that justice isn't something inherent in actions. Justice comes and goes with power structures. So whoever is the strongest decides what they want to be just, what they want people who are ruled to do, and those who are ruled follow those rules because they either want to avoid bad consequences or they're seeking some kind of good consequences. But the idea of justice for Thrasymachus is not valuable in and of itself. People only act justly because of the repercussions. Because this is so antithetical, as you'll see, to Plato's ideas in general, Plato sets Socrates up with his other interlocutors, Glaucon and Adimantus, who, by the way, were also real persons. They were Plato's brothers. Glaucon and Adimantus challenge Socrates to prove that being just is good for its own sake, even if you see no good consequences from doing just actions, or even more, if you suffer bad consequences because you've done a just action. Socrates accepts this challenge and comes up with an ingenious way to both explain the nature of justice and to make an argument that justice is good for its own sake. The device Socrates uses to argue about the nature of justice is a thought experiment. He offers to Glaucon and Adimantus that they will create, in thought, the perfect nation state. In their time, it would have been a city, so they call it the just city, also referred to at times as Callipolis. In the experiment, Socrates and his interlocutors can just stipulate what they think the most just form of government would be. The idea being that if we can see it in the macro scale, what justice is in a state, we can then also see what it might be in the micro scale, which would be justice in a person. Ultimately, Socrates will argue that the best life is for the person who is ruled by reason. You might ask why this might be the case. He's responding to one particular aspect of the challenge. Glaucon and Adimantus present Socrates with the myth of Gyges, wherein Gyges finds a ring that makes him invisible, and he uses the ring to his advantage in what follows. The myth is very well known, and Glaucon and Adimantus are using it in order to get Socrates to argue that a just person would not use the ring in the way that Gyges did, simply because it's just the wrong thing to do. In particular, Glaucon is concerned with this idea that people are not really willingly just. They're simply just in order to get a good outcome or to avoid a bad outcome. Here are the arguments that you will see as you're going through the text. It's interesting to imagine what any one of us would do if we had some way to secure our invisibility, to go about undetected. What would our actions be like? This is the central element of the challenge of the myth of Gyges. This is a strong challenge where Glaucon tells Socrates, right now I'm unconvinced that I should be just. It seems to me actually that the unjust person is happier than the person who is just. Thus they leave Socrates with this set of tasks at hand: to prove that justice is good in itself, that being just is enough to make a person happy, even without honor or material goods, and to explain why justice in and of itself is worthy and not just its consequences. Socrates will analogize a person to a nation by describing what the most just possible nation might be like. First of all, the most just nation will have a division of labor. Into these three parts. The rulers, which Socrates later will come to characterize as philosopher kings. Philosophers being those who are lovers of wisdom. The military class, the auxiliaries, and the artisan class, or the workers. In a just state, each class works together without intervening in the other's tasks. So, for example, the judgment of what the best outcomes for the state would be is what is pursued by the rulers. So the workers of the military are not trying to do the job of the rulers. Likewise, the rulers are not trying to do the job of the military, which corresponds to courage. It's the practical application of the determinations of the rulers. And last, moderation is the self-control exercised in a person by keeping desires in check. In the just state, it's exercised by following the dictates of the rulers, which is enforced by the auxiliaries or the military. The whole city then is just because each part is doing its own work and not meddling. All of the parts are functioning in harmony. So just as you have the three parts of the just state, there are three parts of the soul. You'll often hear this referred to as Plato's tripartite soul. Like the rulers, there's reason. That's a part of the soul. Spirit is basically the seat of the emotions, the kind of thing that makes us feel envy or anger or grief, pride, those types of feelings. And then there are the appetites. These are the manifestation of the needs of the physical body. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between spirit and appetite. For example, anger seems to be very close to both. The way to tell the difference is that the spirit's passions are responsive to reason. They may not be rational, but they are responsive to reason. But hunger is not responsive to reason. If your body needs food, it's going to be hungry. There's no way to reason yourself out of it. Just as balance and harmony is virtue in the city, virtue in the soul is also a balance and harmony of the three parts of the soul. So the spirit and the appetite should always be subject to the dictates of reason. A person who lives by the principles of reason, will have clear understanding of the moral truths, and because they know the moral truth, they will act virtuously. In other words, this means that anybody who acts viciously does so out of ignorance. They simply haven't learned properly what the good actually is. The reason that we want to pursue justice is that being just ensures the health of the soul. If the soul is out of balance, then it causes illness in the same way as it might with the body. You could make an analogy there. So justice is desirable in itself because it is itself the health of the soul. Remember that Plato thinks everyone acts from a belief that what they pursue is good. So the difference between somebody who acts morally virtuously and someone who acts viciously is whether or not they have a correct belief about what is good. So for example, ordinarily we know water is good, and we will drink water because we know it's good for our bodies. But if you drank water that had a poisonous agent in it, you wouldn't drink it unless you believed incorrectly that that particular water was good for you. Nobody would drink the poison knowing that that's what it was. This is Plato's theory. You may disagree with him, but this is his theory. Now, how is it that we come up with this wisdom? Where does reason get the wisdom? You're going to see emerging from Republic what we call Plato's theory of forms. He believes that what makes our consciousness of objects and understanding them possible is the fact that we have an understanding of abstract ideas. The forms are the abstract ideas that correspond to objects in our sensory perception. They're theoretical, so they can't be made known to the senses. We can only understand them rationally. However, they're eternal and they're objective. They're the same for everybody. These are the kinds of ideas he's thinking about. The good itself, the just itself. So these are the very concepts of these things. Goodness itself, love itself, the concept of number itself, etc. Very abstract. What Plato believes is that in order for us to say that we truly have knowledge, we must have knowledge of the forms. We never have knowledge about the mere appearances of perception. We can get true beliefs about that, but it doesn't give us knowledge. And this is why the philosophers should be the kings, because the philosophers have the best understanding of these abstract concepts. They have the best understanding of what's really good, of what's really just, of what's really virtuous, etc. In the last part of Republic that we'll be looking at, Plato has three analogies for us to understand the nature of knowledge. And therefore, for example, in the moral case, what do we have to know in order for us to be virtuous? First, we have the simile of the sun. This analogy is designed to explain the relationship between knowledge and the form of the good. So the good, again, is the abstract concept of goodness itself. Socrates compares knowledge to vision in order to make this claim. In the case of vision, the eye can't have an image without the sun. The sun provides the light by which we're able to use our eyes to see objects. Likewise, in the case of knowledge, it's the soul, right, that is the organ, if you will, of knowledge, but without the form of the good, the soul cannot have knowledge. So the form of the good illuminates ideas so that the soul can grasp them. Then we have the simile of the divided line. In this case, Socrates is saying that everything that exists, the entire universe, can be likened to a divided line. There's two realms that the line divides a universe into. There's the realm of that which is visible and the realm of that which is intelligible, meaning something we can only understand rationally. So for example, the number 2 itself is not something we can ever see. It's an abstract concept. Thus, as an idea, it would belong to the intelligible realm and not to the visible realm. The visible realm is the world of tables and chairs and bicycles and cats, things that we can have sensory experience of. This analogy rests on our understanding that in the visible realm, physical objects are more real than their reflections or their shadows. In our case, we could use photographs as an example. After all, a photograph is a reflection that we've managed to capture more permanently. Physical objects are more real than their images because the image is cast from the physical object. Likewise, the visible realm is an image of the intelligible realm. So the seat of reality for Plato is the intelligible realm, and it's related to the visible realm in that things that are visible in sense experience are reflections of these abstract ideas. They're reflections of these concepts. Ultimately, Plato will take these two analogies and then bundle them into what we call the allegory of the cave. Here, Socrates is giving an analogy whereby prisoners are locked in a cave and they're so tightly bound that the only thing they can do is stare at a wall in front of them. There's a fire behind them, and there are people that are putting objects in front of the fire so as to create shadows on the wall in front of the prisoners. Plato's point is that if the prisoners only ever look at the wall, they're going to believe that the shadows that they see on the wall are real. But of course, according to the allegory, they're not. In fact, the real objects are 2 levels away from them, above ground, outside of the cave. How does the analogy work? People who believe that reality is only in objects that we see in sense experience are like the prisoners, because those are the shadows of the abstract ideas that are the forms. When a prisoner escapes, this is when she goes on her journey to realizing that the seat of reality is in ideas rather than with physical objects. When you're looking through the allegory of the cave, remember that it's an analogy. Plato is trying to explain what it's like for a person to go from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge. I hope you enjoyed this lecture on Plato, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the new lecture on Aristotle.